Okay, let's get going for our next talk tonight. And I think this is a very timely topic. The weather's getting warmer now, the buds are breaking, the frost is coming out of the ground, and now's the time to plant and transplant your trees and shrubs. And we're really fortunate tonight to have Steve Sagaser from the Grand Forks County office. He's the he's a horticulture specialist there. And Steve's going to give us the whole lowdown on about how to dig the plants and how to protect the roots and how to dig a hole, and then even the follow-up care for our newly moved trees and shrubs. So let's welcome Steve to the forum.
Good evening, everyone. I'm assuming we have a number of gardeners out there, because if you're not a gardener, you shouldn't be watching right now. So this is just for gardeners' ears only. If you're a gardener, you're probably not real happy with your yard, because I know gardeners really well, and I know how gardeners act. And they're always moving their trees and shrubs around. They move their trees and shrubs around the way people move their furniture around in their living room. So what I want to do is give you about 16 years worth of experience that I had when I was in the nursery industry, the nursery landscape industry, to help you have successful plant moving expeditions in your yards. So let's go ahead and get started. We need to talk a little bit about site assessment, and also some of these things about what to plant or transplant when. Let's talk a little bit about soil preparation. We'll actually talk about the digging process and then the transportation process when you get that plant dug or purchased at a nursery, because we're going to tailor this presentation to not just you going out balding and burlapping or digging up bare root, a tree or a shrub, but also how you would take a plant home from the nursery, how you would remove it, and how you get it in the ground. So some of those things we're going to be talking about also are how you're going to replant it, and spring and fall preparations for care. So first of all, we got to cover this base. It's the law. If you're going to be digging more than 12 inches deep, you have to make a phone call. That phone call is 811. It's called North Dakota One Call. Now, whether you're the gardener or you're the contractor, this is your responsibility. Don't be like this poor woman trying to rescue her husband standing on a catalog, trying to push him away from an electrical incursion. Keep that spade or shovel away from the high power lines. It's safer for you, and it's safer for your pocketbook. So make sure that you make that one call. Now let's talk about planning ahead. You want to know what plants, first of all, whether you're purchasing them or whether you're digging them up to take them to a new piece of property because you just can't leave that particular plant in your old residence, or we want to make sure that you're planning ahead. You also want to make sure that you're handling the plants properly. They need to be handled carefully at all times. They're not like a piece of hard merchandise that you can put on a shelf and assume that it's going to be just as good when you go back a few weeks later to pick it up and do something with it as it would if it was a plant. They have to be handled properly. We also want to talk about the actual process of digging, making the hole large enough, and always planting at the same depth. Those are some things that we need to stress. And I'm going to cover some of these topics right at the end, so that these are going to be some take-home messages. And we also want to talk about how you're going to support trees. It's one thing to dig them up or plant them, and then you just don't walk away. That's when the real work begins. That's when the care and maintenance takes place. And then also making sure that you have an adequate water source for the plants that you've planted. So let's take a look at this diagram here. Most roots that you'll see on a typical tree, now there are some exceptions, most roots are going to be within that top 10 to 12 inches of soil. You're going to want to dig your planting hole so it's going to be at the same depth so that when you plant the tree or shrub that you've purchased or you've dug up, it's going to be at the same depth as the root ball that you're planning to dig. And also the holes need to be deeper than the holes that are actually deeper than the root ball will cause that tree or shrub to settle. Then you have some real issues developing. If the tree survives at all, it'll take years for it to recover, or if the shrub survives. And I can cite you an example of where I planted a basswood a number of years ago, planted it about 3 inches too deep. It did survive, but it took that tree about 4 years for it to finally start to grow again. It just languished for about 4 years, kind of pouted for a while. So getting your trees planted back at the same depth, or even if you're going to make an error on the depth, error on a little bit too shallow, that's really important. So let's talk about site assessment. We need to look at things like proximity to trees, other trees or shrubs or structures, patios, decks. What's the long-term impact that planting a tree or a shrub in that location is going to have. And how much sunlight, how much, little, is it going to be too much sunlight, or is it going to be not enough? I don't think you'd have a problem with too much sunlight, but you need to have at least a half a day of sunlight for most trees and shrubs to survive adequately. What sort of wind situations are you going to be dealing with? If you're taking a tree from one location or a shrub from one location where it receives very little wind and putting it into a situation where it's going to be in a wind tunnel where it gets extreme amounts of wind, it's going to be really tough on that plant's ability to survive. Think about microclimates, and again, think about water availability. So here's the situation. This is a yard where about 50 feet from one part of the yard to another, you've got extreme amounts of shade on the left, and that's about 70 to 80% shaded during the most of the day. But then the part of the house and the yard that's on the right has 100% amount of sunlight during the rest of the day. So those are situations you have to take into consideration when you're looking at your site assessment. Also, you should be looking at the type of soil that you're dealing with. Texture of soil is important. If it's sandy and well drained, that's a good thing, but you're probably going to have to add some organic matter, and you'll probably have to add additional nutrients. If it's a clay soil, not such a good thing, but you can still alleviate that a little bit by adding some organic matter as well. You'll also need some tools for transplanting, and this is one of my favorite things, because whenever I start a project, I usually figure out a way to get a new tool. So you'll need to have, I recommend, a flat edge spade and a spading fork, what you would call a potato digging fork. You'll need a good wheelbarrow or some sort of garden cart. Some pruners are important, and if you want to remember what the plants are that you just moved, you'll want to put some labels on them, and then pick up some compost or some peat moss as an additive for the soil. Now, there's a right tool for any job, and so this is your opportunity to go shopping and pick up those right tools. That flat edge spade is one of my favorite tools. You'll also need a wheelbarrow to hold the soil, and this is the wheelbarrow that my wife bought me, but this is the one I wish I had bought, and holds a lot more soil and it's a whole lot more fun to drive. But you'll need a good lopper too, and a good side cutting type of pruning shears, and probably a pruning saw. Let's talk about the way tree roots are packaged. They're packaged basically three ways. Bare root, which means basically there's no soil on the roots. They're balled and burlapped, or they might be container grown. Now, we can split hairs over what's container grown, what's potted, and what's containerized. So I'll just make it real simple for you right now. If it's containerized, it has to have been, that tree or shrub has to have been in the plant for more than a year. If it's potted, it means it's been in the container for less than a year. And most nurseries, when they get their trees and shrubs in the spring, one of the first things they'll do is take those bare root plants that they purchased and put them into a pot, and then they're grown as a potted and sold as a potted plant. Now, if they're kept in that plant for more than a year, then they become a container grown or a containerized tree or shrub. I would like to suggest to you that if you're purchasing a tree or shrub in the spring, and this is the time to do that, when those nursery trees come in, they would rather sell them to you bare root, because they don't have to put the time and labor into potting them that they would, and then they can actually sell them to you for a discounted price. So your task is to get out to your local nursery right now and see if they have the particular kind of tree or shrub that you might be looking for in its bare root state, and then take it home. You can take home a whole carload or a whole landscape planting in the trunk of your car versus taking it home in a 2-ton truck if it was all balled and burlapped or potted or containerized. So balled and burlapped, B&B, that's the way most nursery folks refer to it, and that's basically a plant that's dug with the ball of soil and the roots intact. And the roots will probably, the soil probably will be wrapped in some burlap. And the thing that you need to keep in mind, whether you're purchasing a balled and burlapped plant or digging it up yourself, is you have to handle it with kid gloves. You have to handle it like it's really, really tender. Because if you drop that ball and break the ball of soil, even just crack it a little bit, what happens is it breaks all the hair roots loose. And then you have essentially nothing more than the equivalent of a bare root plant with soil around it, because you've broken that structure. You have to handle it very carefully, and you have to handle it by the ball itself. You can't grab it by the stem and pick it up and move it over and set it back down. So it's really important that you handle it carefully. Container grown or containerized, again, as I just mentioned, these are trees or shrubs that have been potted for more than a year. And we'll get into this a little bit later about how you need to open up the circling roots, and the heaviest roots need to be spread out before you plant them. That's kind of important as well. So bare root, that's just like what it says. These roots there's no soil around the roots. They're lightweight, they're easy to handle. They can be difficult to find at nurseries because a lot of times nurseries in this day and age want to get them into containers right away. So you need to be proactive and get out to your local nurseries and try to purchase them bare root if you're planning on doing anything like this at all. Deciduous trees, I don't think I would try to get anything bare root, whether you're digging it up yourself or purchasing it more than 2 inches in diameter or 2 inches in caliper. It gets to be too much shock to the system of that particular plant if you go much over the 2 inches. So try to keep that in mind. That would be the maximum, in my opinion, diameter or caliper of tree that you would purchase either bare root or dig up yourself bare root. That's not to say I haven't dug some up larger than that bare root, but I've had a machine to dig them for me in one particular case, and I did have some success with it, but I don't recommend that. The other thing about bare root is that you have to plan your planting so that you're digging them in the dormant season and replanting them. This isn't an activity that you would do in the middle of the summer when everything's in full blossom or leafed out and you've got lots of foliage to deal with. I guarantee you will be unsuccessful. So I just threw these slides in, and I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but these are root ball sizes for deciduous trees. So it gives you sort of a guide to go by when you're looking at what sort of types of balls of soil that you need to dig. If you're digging either, this is particularly important for root ball sizes for balled and burlap, but you can also use these as a means for determining the size of a hole and the amount of roots that you should leave if you're digging for bare root. So these are for evergreens, and then these are for columnar shaped evergreens. So let's talk about preparing the planting hole. The first thing you want to do is plan to dig the planting hole quite a bit wider than the ball of soil that you're going to be putting in there or the spreading root system that you're going to be putting in there. Try to dig it about 1.5 times or maybe even twice as wide as the root ball. You don't want to dig it deeper than that, though. If the hole does get too deep, what you're going to want to do is put some soil back into the hole and tamp it down and firm it up again, because you don't want any settling to take place. You probably will get some settling, and so from that standpoint, it's not going to hurt if you maybe plant about 1 inch or 2 shallower than you had anticipated, because that'll allow or accommodate for any settling that might take place. Now, this is something that most people don't do because you don't anticipate this far in advance, but root pruning is really important. In the nursery industry, they do this all the time. So if you're planning to move, for example, a tree or a shrub this coming fall, this is when you would go out, dig a shallow trench around that plant. First of all, if it's a shrub, pull the branches up and tie them in place so that you have some room to work with. Then dig your shallow trench out about the same width as what you're anticipating either as your balled and burlapped plant would be dug at or your bare root plant would be dug at. And then slice down through the roots as much as you can, but not everything, with your flat edge spade. The larger roots you may have to cut with a lopper or some sort of pruner. When you're all done, put the soil back in the same order that you took it out. So the subsoil goes back in first, and then the topsoil goes back in after that, and then water everything good. And then plan to give that plant some water. If it's in the spring that you've done this, some water over the spring, summer, and fall. And then that plant will have developed a nice, beautiful root system for you when you dig it up in the fall. If you decide you're going to move, and it's in the fall, and you decide you're going to replant a plant in the following spring, you would do the same thing. But it's best if you do it the opposite season do your root pruning in the opposite season from when you plan to plant it. Now, if you just don't really want to get down and dirty, this is one way you can move a tree or dig a tree. I've done thousands of these myself. I've owned several tree movers and have moved trees and shrubs by hand and with machines like this for a lot of people and had excellent success. Oops, we just lost something.
Is it on your screen? Is it on that computer? Or we still computer shut down? Is it not powered on somehow? Oh, the thing came out. It is out here, right? Steve, why don't you come around and just look at the pause screen?
Okay.
We can advance before you're there, so we can keep going.
Okay.
Until we get that machine. You
Sure.
can that.
This one here?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so what we want to talk about is getting the digging done. You want to, first of all, tie up branches of the shrubs. If it's on a shrub that you're working with, that'll make the digging a lot easier. Then it's always a good idea to take some twine or some yarn and tie it around the soil line where that tree and shrub is. In this particular case, you can see the grass there, so I didn't have to do that on this tree that I dug. And then some people will say you always need to mark the north side of the tree or shrub. Personally, I have never really worried about this, because when you go to buy a tree or a shrub at a nursery, how do you know what the north side of it is? How do you know it's not the south side of it you're planting it? So orientation can be a good thing. It's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about. I don't lose any sleep over it at night. So shrubs under 3 feet, you can consider digging them bare root, and anything that's about 1 inch or more in caliper, and you're measuring that about 6 inches off the ground, that's going to be easy for you to go ahead and dig bare root. When you get upwards of 2 inches in diameter or caliper, then you're asking for a lot of work and you're going to need a lot of help. So let's plan to go ahead and get this tree dug here.
Let's try the arrow.
Okay, there we go. I think I got it to advance that time.
Okay.
So let's start with digging that trench around the perimeter. Dig that trench out nice and wide, and make yourself some room. And then the next step is to get down like you're praying at that tree on your hands and knees. Take your shovel, hold it in a vertical position, and face that shovel's blade towards you. Now what you're going to do is begin a chopping down, digging through the soil and the roots and pulling that soil back towards you. And then start scooting your way around the tree, always digging down, chopping through it, pulling the soil back. The object of this is to leave a totally undisturbed ball of soil. If you do that, then you've got an essentially beautiful little balled and burlapped plant. But what you don't want to do, and that's what most people do, is they'll stand up straight and tall, they'll take that shovel or that spade of theirs and start digging down underneath. That will work, of course, if you're trying to do something bare root. But when you're trying to ball and burlap, you want to leave that ball of soil totally undisturbed as best you can. So working around the plant, chopping down, digging down, pulling the soil back towards you, that's what you want to be shooting for. Now, when you've got it down to the correct depth, that's where that flat edge spade is going to come in handy. You'll have that ball of soil starting to quiver, starting to shake a little bit. It's almost ready to pop out, but there are still some roots at the bottom. And this is where you need to take that flat edge spade. Now you're standing up, take that flat edge spade and kind of work it down at about a 45-degree angle on one side, move to the opposite direction, shove it down underneath, and cut whatever remaining roots are there, and then do that on the 2 other opposite sides as well. And when you've got it to the point where it's nice and loose, you could basically roll it out of the hole, that's when you need to get out your burlap or some other type of cloth and force it down, basically roll the ball over to one side, push the burlap down, and then roll the ball back to the opposite side. Kind of picture it like you're diapering a baby. You just want to pull that burlap up around and use some twine and some nails to fasten it in place. And if you do that, then it's going to make it a lot easier to handle and a lot easier to move. Now, this is not going to be a light ball of soil. This particular tree here is a 1-inch diameter maple that I dug out, and the ball of soil was about 150 pounds. If you go to a 2-inch ball of soil and you have it dug at the right diameter, you're going to be looking at well over 200 pounds of soil and tree that you're going to be moving there. So you're going to need to get some serious help with that. Now, we talked a little bit about bare root. Bare root does not work well for evergreens. So with evergreen trees, you're going to want to keep trees and shrubs that you're digging bare root at least 2 feet or smaller, no larger than that. Trees or evergreens do not like to be without soil around their roots. These are some soil conservation trees that you see us planting here on Arbor Day. And when you go with a 2-foot tall spruce or pine, you're going to be okay. You get much bigger than that, they're not going to survive. So, and again, they should only be planted when they're dormant. Digging bare root, the one thing, I guess, if there's a take-home message here, is that you always need to keep those roots moist. But dig them the same way you would dig a balled and burlap plant, always digging down, pulling the soil away. But the other thing you're going to be doing when you're digging that plant is grasping the main trunk about at your waist height or chest height and gently moving it back and forth several different directions to kind of loosen it up and not pull it out. You don't want to break any roots that don't need to be broken, but you want to loosen it up and help it to become more free and able to be separated from the soil. So continue to dig around that root system, always gently moving it back and forth and loosening the plants so that at some point when you've got enough soil removed, it'll basically pop right out of the ground. Once you get that plant out of the ground, then just give it a good little shake, because you don't want to have to carry any more soil around, because that's heavy than necessary. But this is also the point where you're going to want to get your sprayer or your hose out and mist those roots down. You never want those roots to dry out. They should never be totally exposed to the sun and the wind for maybe more than 30 to 60 to 90 seconds. This is the type of a plant or a type of a planting situation where you need to have your hole already prepared and dug before this plant goes back into the ground. That doesn't mean you can't keep it out of the ground for a number of days and perhaps even weeks, depending on how well you keep those roots protected. But when it becomes to when you get to the point where you're going to get it planted, you need to make sure that the roots aren't exposed to the sun and the wind for more than just a minute or two. You should have everything ready, and then it should go into the ground, and then that's when you begin to cover it up. Now, if you're traveling for more than a few miles, now this holds true whether you're moving a bare root tree that has no leaves on it, or you've purchased a tree or a shrub at the nursery. You want to make sure, first of all, that the roots are moist if it's bare root, but if it's potted or ball and burlap, that needs to be watered as well, because it's going to be using moisture as you're traveling. I just shudder when I see people with a pickup load of trees traveling down the highway at 60 miles an hour. Things are bent over double. There's no foliage or any leaves left by the time they get to where they're going. Folks, you don't have to do this. You should be wrapping, first of all, making sure that the plant is well watered, and then wrap the branches with burlap, a tarp, or some sort of cloth to protect them. That's important. But what's even more important is when you get to where you're going, you need to almost immediately unwrap those branches. If you don't do that, what's going to happen if it's a warm, sunny day, you'll get some heating taking place, especially if there are leaves on those branches. And in no time at all, those leaves will be fried, and potentially it could even kill the branches, and or in the case of evergreens, it could ruin the needles. Now, we've already talked about planting at the same height as they were growing before. If you're planting a tree or a shrub that was purchased at a nursery and it was growing in a container, how do you know it's at the same height, at the right height, the correct height? You need to find that trunk flare. So pull some of that soil back. Try to find where that trunk flare is or where that root flare is. And if you have to even dig down around about it, dig down into it a little bit, go ahead and do that. And then you're probably going to have some circling roots. I like to take a sharp box cutter knife or something, depending on the size of the plant, and cut straight down through those roots, those circling roots, and separate them out, pull them out a little bit. Yeah, it's a little bit difficult for the plant. It'll survive though, and that's going to keep that plant from developing a circling root problem and potentially girdling the tree down the road. And also, if you're going to be using some anchoring stakes, this is a good time to get those into the ground. Otherwise, potentially, depending on where you put your stakes, you might be busting through some roots if you're pounding those stakes in after you've gotten everything planted. So I like to put the anchor stakes in before I even put the tree into the ground, and then before I start backfilling. This is a tree that was planted at the wrong depth. Do you see that telephone appearance there? This is another tree that was planted too deep. You see the root flare where it's supposed to be? This is what can happen when you plant too deep. You get trunk decomposition. You get that trunk rotting. This can also happen if you've got the mulch pushed too close to your tree. So when you're getting ready to plant your balled and burlap tree, it's always a good idea to take a bolt cutter, if you have one that's had a wire basket planted, holding the burlap together. Make sure you get all that wire basket off. Take all the burlap off, take all the twine off, that's really important. And then center the plant in the hole. Planting a little bit shallow is probably a better idea than planting too deep. Certainly don't plant too deep. Err on the side of planting too shallow. Get that plant in the hole, make sure that you can see the trunk flare. Add your topsoil, tamp it lightly, and get some water on it, and it's going to be ready to take off and start growing. Basically, you want to use the same type of procedure when you're planting bare root. The one thing that's really cool about bare root planting, though, is that if you've got some really prized roots and you want to make sure that they're going to survive, then you can dig your hole at different odd shapes and to make sure that those roots have room to grow. Just planting bare root trees, just as sort of a brief little set of diagrams. Soak the roots. If these are trees or shrubs that you've purchased and you don't know how long they've been in transit, chances are the roots are dried out. I like to soak them for a few hours before planting, and then always dig your hole wider than the roots are, because you don't want to be cramming the roots in. I always trim roots when I'm planting bare root. This is where your lopper comes into play. So here's a good message, a good take-home message. When you're planting bare root, look for those roots that are, first of all, going to be too wide to fit into that hole, and cut them back. Any roots that are busted, broken, or crossed over or turned back in, you can remove those. Wherever you make a nice clean cut, especially on the big thick roots, you're going to get a whorl of new fibrous or hair roots coming out of that nice clean cut. And so if you've got a broken root or a damaged one, that's where you want to get that lopper out and make a nice clean cut. And then get some cheap labor like these kids here on Arbor Day, and you can be the one spreading the roots out and looking important, and have them do the work for you, and make sure that you don't have any of those roots twisting or circling as they start to fill the soil back in. Add the subsoil. Put the soil back basically in the same order that you took it out. So the subsoil goes back in first, water it a little bit, add the topsoil, tamp the soil lightly, and then let it soak away, and then water it again. We aren't going to talk about that too much. So here's basically where we started. Plan your planting. Choose the plants that you know are going to fit. Handle your plants carefully. Plant at the correct time of the year. So if you're planting bare root, or if you're digging balled and burlap, they should be dormant. They should be in the spring or the fall. Make the hole large enough. Always plant at the same depth. Err on the side of planting too shallow if you're going to make an error in depth. And make sure that you're taking precautions when planting in heavy or poorly drained soil. You may have to add some organic matter. Support your tall trees, because the trees get leafed out, even if there's not a lot of wind pressure on them when they're bare root. When they get leaves on, that's just like a big sail, and those trees aren't going to stand up on their own. You'll have to support them. But I like to always leave the anchoring wires or ropes loose so that tree has an opportunity to wiggle back and forth, and that helps to stimulate some root production as well. And be sure to get adequate water. I've seen more plants, though, die from too much water than from not enough water. So my rule of thumb is to water them very thoroughly when you first plant them, whether it's a tree or shrub. Give them a double watering, in fact. Then about 3 or 4 days later, water again. And after that, ignore them for about 7 to 10 days. And just try to come back about every 7 to 10 days and give whatever tree or shrub it is a good thorough soaking, and they'll do a lot better than if you overwatered. And if you've done everything correctly, then you've done a good job, and it's a job well done.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And are there any questions out there from our audience? Now's the time to type them in. Steve, did you want to talk about like moving oak trees? I heard once that you have to be careful about moving large oak trees. Is that true?
It's very true, Tom. Trees with deep taproot, like oak trees and black walnuts are another one, are very difficult to move. And that's why when you go to a nursery to purchase, let's say, a bur oak, or for lack of a better example, a black walnut, you're not going to find a very, very tall tree, especially if it's been grown properly. They're going to be a short tree in a tall, lengthy container. That's because that taproot is so important. So my advice, if you're planning to plant a bur oak, for example, purchase one at a nursery or plant your own. Plant an acorn. And if you're going to plant lots of acorns and they grow fast for you, and oaks actually don't grow that slow, then get them moved when they're only a foot or two tall. Because if you're trying to move an oak tree that's even 5 or 6 or 8 feet tall, you're digging through a lot of taproot, and the survivability of that tree is not going to be all that good. They are not an easy tree to plant.
And how about, is now the best time to be moving our trees and shrubs?
As soon as the soil is unfrozen in the spring, yes, it is a good time to move, especially if you're planning to move trees and shrubs bare root. But remember what we talked about root pruning. If you've got a prized possession, a prized tree or shrub that you want to make sure it transplants without a whole lot of shock to the system. And let's be honest, transplanting always creates a shock to the tree system. But I would suggest if you're planning to move it and you've got some time to deal with it, then let's do some root pruning. Remember how we talked about root pruning? Get that done first, get that done this spring, and then plan to move it next fall, or do it next fall and move it a year from this spring. If you aren't prepared to do that, if you don't have the time to do that, then by all means, go ahead and get your moving done when it is dormant. So balled and burlapped, bare root, both move nicely in the dormant season. That said, if you are moving to a location where you want to take some of your old property with you in the form of trees, shrubs, or even perennials, then just use extra caution. Dig them up and go ahead and take them with you. You'll have some shock to the system, but you can still do it. It's not the ideal time, but if you're careful and if you take a large enough ball of soil, you'll be successful.
Okay, Steve, how about we have a root-bound containerized tree? How should he cut the roots?
That's a great question. The first thing you need to do is remove the container. How do you remove the container? It depends on how long or how root bound that tree is. If you can lay it on its side, if it's, let's say, a 10-gallon container, if you can lay it on its side and remove the container by pulling it off, then it's not too much of a problem. But if it's refusing to come out, stand it back up straight again, and whether it's a metal container, you might have to use a saw or a snips to cut the bottom out and then down the side and peel it away. If it's a plastic container, just use a sharp knife, cut the bottom out, and then cut down the side or the along the side and peel the container away. Now that you've gotten that done, this is when you need to be creative. That's when you get out your loppers or your pruners or your box cutter and cut multiple slices, from vertical slices from top to bottom. I like to cut in at least a ½ inch to an inch. I know it sounds awful. It sounds like you're cutting arms and legs off, but really they're only roots. And then start to dig your fingers into that ball of soil and peel those roots out a little bit. And make sure that you don't leave any roots wanting to go in a circle. You should have a nice mass of roots peeling out from that ball of soil, and then go ahead and set it into the hole that you've gotten prepared already.
How about fertilizing a tree when you plant it?
Fertilizing a tree when you plant it is not something I do. I'm not saying that folks don't do it, but or shouldn't do it, but I don't do it because I don't want to cause any more shock to the tree system than necessary. If you've got relatively good soil and you've put the soil back in the way you took it out, so that you've set your topsoil over here and your subsoil over here, put it back in that order. And then after a year or so of seeing very little growth, or if the tree doesn't look like it's adapting, that would be the time to put some fertilizer on it.
Can you talk about when would be the time when you would get a spade and tree versus a ball and burlap or containerized?
I've moved thousands of trees with tree spades, and there is a right way and a wrong way and a right time and a wrong time to do that. They, again, should be moved when it's the dormant season. But with that said, you can push that a little bit by moving the season earlier in the summer. But if, for example, spruce and pines just don't move good at all with tree spades or with tree movers, because they have a more horizontal root system versus a spruce where the roots tend to go down more. And so when you cut the roots of a pine tree, as you're moving it, you're taking a larger percentage of the roots off and leaving it with less to grow on. Spruce, on the other hand, the roots are more uniform in the way they spread out and go down, so you get a larger percentage of those. In either case, when the new growth on a spruce or a pine starts to get out for more, in a case of a spruce, when that new growth is more than about a ½ inch, that's the time to not move them anymore in the spring. The same with the pine. As soon as that new growth starts to expand a little bit, don't move them anymore. Now, here's the cool secret that most people don't realize. When that new growth is fully hardened up, that's going to be sometime about mid-July. And if you or your tree mover is large enough, it's designed for the diameter of that tree, and so it's going to take the adequate amount of soil and dig the adequate size hole, you can start moving those trees, those pines and spruce, sometime about mid to late July. You don't have to wait till August or September or October. And by doing it then, you're not going to worry about killing that new growth, And you're going to have the advantage of the remainder of the growing season for those roots to reestablish themselves. But it's also important to make sure that you're providing adequate water. So you're going to soak those trees up, fill that slit around that ball of soil, because you don't want that air gap. Wash it down, fill it up, wash it down again, that soil. And then a good soaking for the rest of this growing season and on up until the soil freezes solid is what it's going to take to keep that tree or shrub alive. And you're also going to need to make sure that you've got it adequately anchored. And those anchors aren't tight. They've got to be loose so that tree has a little bit of movement.
Okay, we're going to have some quick answers here. Rapid fire questions, answers.
Mm-hmm.
How about hazelnuts? Is there a best place for a hazelnut? Do we need 2 of them?
Good question on pollination. I have hazelnuts in my yard, but they were planted as 12 inches, and it took them about a year or 2 to start growing. I've got them about 8 feet apart, and I haven't had any fruit on them yet. I don't know much more about their how to cultivate them and take care of them, other than just the fact that get them planted. They take a little while to adapt, and they should grow for you. They're a native plant to North Dakota.
Okay. Sunny spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
How about, are you concerned about maple trees when you plant them in spring and then we get a late frost on them?
Not so much. The important thing to keep in mind with maple trees is to cover the trunk. Put some sort of tree wrap on them, because they will get sun scald or they'll get some sort of sunburn, and then you'll be disappointed because you'll get some sort of rot or decomposition taking place on the south or the southwest side. And you need to do that with a maple tree until the trunk's about 4 to 5 inches in diameter, because then it's thick enough that it can withstand that. If you think about where maples typically grow, they grow in forests and they shade each other's trunks. When you stick it out in the middle of your lawn, where's the shade coming from unless you put it on there? So protect those trunks on your maple trees.
Okay, how about, you talked earlier about the type of soil can make a difference, and with the clay soil and organic matter, how does that work when you plant trees? Like, should we be changing the native soil, or how do you blend in organic matter into a clay soil?
You know, I wouldn't go any more than 1/3 organic matter to 2/3 clay. And the other thing is, ultimately you want the tree or shrub to be able to grow in the surrounding soil. You can't always be going in there and amending it. That's just to give your soil a little bit more porosity. A clay soil is actually harder to work with than a sandy soil. A sandy soil is easier to amend. With a clay soil, you have to do something as well. You have to do something to improve the pore space in the soil. And so a lot of folks think, well, I'm just going to throw a bunch of sand in there. You know what happens when you throw sand in with clay soil? You know what you got? You got concrete. So if you're going to put in sand, you got to put in at least an equal amount of organic matter to really moderate that soil and make it so it's got some tilth to it, some texture to it, some pore space to it.
Okay, last question. Again, with the soil, what do you blend in with clay soil when transplanting trees that came from a non-clay soil?
Again, organic matter. You can't go wrong with organic matter, but you still don't want to go more than 1/3 organic matter, because then you create an unnatural environment for those roots. You do want the roots to acclimate to the native soil that they're going to ultimately be growing in.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Steve, very much. We're ready to start planting. Thank you.